Hello, and welcome back to the Hearsay podcast, a joint project between Pro Bono Students Canada, University of Calgary chapter, and CJSW 90.9 FM. This is a podcast where University of Calgary law students discuss a variety of legal topics with a plethora of professionals in the field. We'd like to emphasize that the information you hear today is legal information and not legal advice, as we are law students and not lawyers. This podcast is purely for informational purposes. If you do require legal advice, please consult a lawyer, as there is no substitute for a professional. My name is Dylan Clark, and together with my partner Gabrielle Freeman, today we will be interviewing Jody Freeman, a Canadian-born Harvard law professor who also happens to be the aunt of my partner Gabrielle. At Harvard, Professor Freeman is a leading scholar of administrative and environmental law. Her work focuses on federal regulation, climate and energy policy, executive power, and judicial review. She served in the Obama White House. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Our discussion with Professor Freeman will be divided into two parts, examining the Trump administration's first month in power and its potential impacts on Canada, particularly in areas such as structural deregulation and environmental policy. In the spirit of reconciliation, we would first like to acknowledge that Hearsay is recorded on Treaty 7 territory. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. I would also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on the land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. You're listening to the Hearsay Podcast on CJSW 90.9 FM.
So, Professor Freeman, thank you so much for joining us today and making time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and you can call me Jody.
Okay, thank you, Jody. To start us off, how do U.S. elections in general impact Canada? Why is it important for Canadians to pay attention to the outcomes south of the border? And how might Trump's victory impact Canadians broadly?
Well, first of all, I think everybody knows that the U.S. is always, a major influence on Canadian politics, Canadian economics. And ever since I was a kid growing up in Vancouver, I was aware of the big neighbor to the south, the U.S. So, we pay a lot of attention to the United States because, in a way, we often follow U.S. trends, both economic trends and political trends. And we've seen some of that historically, but mostly because, they're our biggest trading partner and in theory, our most important ally. And so what happens in the U.S. really affects us. It affects our economy. It affects our society. Of course, it affects the entire world. But because we're so close and our economies are so interdependent, they have a special influence over us. I also think Canadians historically have admired a lot about the U.S. A lot of Canadians have gone to work for parts of their career in the U.S. Their kids get educated. Some of the kids go and stay, but some come back. And sort of there's this sense of U.S. as a land of opportunity, and they do some things very well. And at least historically, I think Canadians have largely admired a lot about the U.S., and I suspect that may be changing right now with the election of President Trump for his second term. Just to answer the last part of your question, I think this election is so consequential because Trump is such a difference from the past. And his agenda, I think, is quite shocking to many Canadians. And it's such a departure from traditional Republican presidents, even very conservative presidents, that I think a lot of the Canadian population is watching with some alarm. And I have to say, I agree with that alarm.
Trump has issued more executive orders in the first month of his term than any president in the past 40 years has done in the first 100 days of their respective administrations. Why is the Trump administration issuing this many orders in such a short period of time?
Well, I think the number and the pace of action from a political perspective, is very purposefully designed to do what they are describing themselves as shock and awe. I think the idea of the kind of overwhelming nature of the flurry of activity is, in a sense, about disabling the response. It's very hard to know what to aim at when every day and multiple times a day there's a new announcement from the White House, there's a new executive order signed, there's a new policy, there's new action. So I think part of it is actually a strategy to make it very, very hard for people to figure out how to mount opposition. There's not enough space in the media and among reporters, journalists covering this. There's not enough space and time to actually do everything that's necessary to cover what's going on in depth. And so that, I think, is part of the strategy. I think the other part from a political perspective is really just to draw a distinction between the beginning of the Trump administration, which they're portraying as very aggressive, very action-oriented, compared to what they're trying to remind the public from their point of view was a very sleepy Biden presidency. So they're trying to draw a contrast to the end of the Biden presidency and say, see how different we are. We're ready right out of the gate to do all this stuff. The problem is they're going so fast and doing so much that they're making a lot of mistakes. A lot of this can fairly be called unlawful. A lot of it arguably is unconstitutional. In addition to being unlawful, it violates the United States Constitution. And they're willing to take those risks. They're making a bet that they're going to overwhelm the system so that only so many things will wind up being challenged. And I think they're also making a bet that for big issues that ultimately reach the United States Supreme Court, I think they're making a bet that they have a sympathetic court for some, if not most, of the things they're trying to do. And that may turn out to be right, but unlike other administrations, they really don't care about the law. And we've never seen that before. Even Republican administrations that are quite different from the Democratic predecessors when they take over, even a new administration that wants to do things differently, they've always had legal guidance and a care for whether they're violating the law. They care about losing cases in court. This administration so far doesn't seem to mind that they're taking big risks, that they're violating the law in the United States Constitution.
I understand the executive orders and other things the administration is doing, like firing prosecutors and others in the federal workforce, are to some extent testing the limits. But how do we know what is for show and what is not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because at least in this first month, it's only been a month or so since the administration took over. And that's a stunning thing to think about because in such a short time, we've seen so much change. And I think the perspective on this at the start, the first week or two, was, look, everybody, let's wait and see what the administration actually does. Don't watch what they say, watch what they do. And that was a way of sort of saving energy and saving focus for the kinds of things that might really matter versus, as you're saying, the kinds of things that are just for show or performative or rhetorical. I think what we've learned in the first month is they mean what they say. Not a lot is for show. When they say they're going to deport millions of people and they're going to go after criminals, you should believe that they're not stopping with just necessarily people who have committed crimes in addition to being illegally in the country. That's what a lot of people say. Well, they won't go that far. They'll only go for people who've committed crimes in addition to just their status of being in the country without authorization. Well, that's not been the case so far. They've gone beyond just people who've committed additional crimes. They've caught up in the sweep, people who haven't committed any criminal violation, except for the fact that they're unlawfully here. So what I mean to say by all this is there's example after example of people saying, well, wait a minute, let's hold judgment and see if they actually do the things they say they're going to do. Well, so far, I think they've delivered on many of the things that they have suggested they're going to do that people thought they might not follow through on. Some examples, okay? The extent to which they are dismantling the federal government, the amount of firings, as you mentioned, firing prosecutors, the politicization of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice in the United States is the law enforcement agency. These are the prosecutors who enforce the criminal laws. And they have long established procedures and norms around when they actually charge people with crimes, with federal crimes. They don't do it without evidence. They don't do it without the facts. And what you see is career prosecutors who spent 10, 20, 30 years in the Department of Justice, committed to the equal application of the law, fair application of the law, are being fired simply because the Trump team thinks they won't be loyal enough simply because they think these people will resist doing the bidding of the administration, and they're being replaced by people who will just say yes to everything. And imagine what that means. This is the worst version of what people were anticipating happening, because what it means is the system of justice is politicized. If you're a friend of the administration, well, maybe you'll be free of criminal prosecution, like Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. The indictment against him was dismissed. Why? Because the administration thinks he'll be helpful in enforcing the immigration agenda of the president. And if you're an enemy, maybe they'll launch a criminal investigation against you without the normal requisite facts and evidence. So that's a really scary prospect. And a lot of people said, well, wait, let's see what they do. They say that they're going to clean house at the FBI. They say that they're going to clean house at the Department of Justice, but let's not believe it. It's all performative. Let's wait and see. Well, my point is just, we didn't have to wait very long. So that was a long answer, but it's just my way of saying what we thought might be for performance or just rhetorical. Actually, I think we should believe them, that they're going to follow through on these things, many of which, by the way, are documented in Project 2025, the 900-page publication that really laid out a lot of this agenda. Well, a lot of this agenda is being carried out.
And do you believe the courts and Congress will stop the worst of what they aim to do?
I want to be optimistic about that. I'm a law professor, so I'm deeply committed to the rule of law, and to, in the U.S., we have a separation of power system that's different from the Canadian system, but the separation of power system depends on three branches with checks and balances. And we expect that Congress will check the president. The president has some powers to counterbalance Congress, and the courts have some powers that counterbalance both. And we think that system prevents wild swings in policy, requires that there be a certain amount of care when administrations change their minds. That system is designed to prevent rash action. It's also designed to ensure that each branch knows that it has limited powers and therefore needs to cooperate with the other. Especially the president and Congress tend to need to cooperate to get things done. All those things are largely out the window at the moment, given that Congress is inert. Congress is doing nothing to check the president. The Republican Party is entirely cowed, it would appear, giving up even their normal role in ensuring that the president's appointments are sufficiently qualified. Presidents usually get their appointees through for the most part, but there's always one or two situations where the Senate asserts itself and its constitutional authority to give advice and consent, and turns down often one or two nominees to make the point that they have a role in the process. And we've seen nominee after nominee, just egregiously unqualified nominees or unsuitable nominees, like Kash Patel, who's vowed to dismantle the FBI, which is an extremely dangerous proposition. He has an enemies list that he's published that he wants to go after. I mean, this kind of person should never be confirmed by the United States Senate. But we see the Republicans, person after person, just going along. And so the question, will Congress check this president? I think at the moment the answer to that is no, not at all. And it will take a midterm election 2 years from now, and it will take a Democratic victory, at least to take over one chamber, the House at least, in order to enable the Democrats to play an oversight role. Once they have a majority in one of the two chambers, in the House, for example, they control the committees, they can launch investigations and require subpoenas if they need to, administration officials to come testify and hold them to account. Right now, they can't do any of that because they're not in charge of anything in the Congress. So right now, Congress is not, in my view, doing its job by any measure. And the question, will the courts check them, is an open question. It's a great question, because a lot of people, especially we lawyers and law professors, are hoping and relying on the courts to do their job and to declare that at least some of what the administration is doing is unlawful. Now, they might win a few of these cases. They're taking calculated risks. They're willing to really swing for the fences. And I'll give you an example of that. To declare that the president can just fire the heads of independent agencies, the members of independent commissions and boards, that the president has absolute power to fire employees in the federal government, regardless of whatever laws would require them to be fired, only for some malfeasance or neglect of duty. The idea that the president can basically impound money that Congress has appropriated to fund these agencies and to fund overseas aid, the president's taking risks that he's going to win those fights in the courts. And I don't know how they will come out. I think he may win one or two of those, but not all of them. And so we have to wait and see about the courts. Already there have been some lower court decisions that have blocked the president's freeze on funding, these across-the-board freezes on funding. They've been blocked. But to some extent, the administration's been defying those orders, which is astonishing. We just never seen a president defy court orders. And they're sort of negotiating that right now, deciding how openly they want to defy court orders. And a real constitutional showdown will come if the president ultimately were to defy a Supreme Court decision. That's what everybody is waiting to see. It hasn't obviously happened yet, but the short answer to your question is Congress is not playing its constitutional role at the moment, and the courts are on a wait-and-see basis.
Although Trump denied his connection to Project 2025 that you mentioned earlier during his campaign, his recent host of executive orders seem to suggest otherwise. Is the administration following the Project 2025 agenda?
Well, very few people have read all of Project 2025. I've not read all of it. I've read very big portions of it, especially those that are relevant to the work I do, which is about environmental, climate, and natural resources, and so on. I've read a lot of what they plan to do regarding the federal government agencies and the operation of the federal government. And I would say they are very closely tracking Project 2025. It's interesting that the president on the campaign trail, Trump, got away with distancing himself from that agenda. He was essentially let off the hook. He just said, I don't know anything about it, even though his close advisors were co-authors of the document. We've often seen documents like this from conservative organizations, the Heritage Organization, and it's not a surprise that they write an agenda out that they wish to see a new president implement. But in this instance, at least some members of this administration who were authors on Project 2025 are now in positions of enormous power. So let me give you one example. Russell Vought, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget within the White House, sounds like an obscure agency nobody's ever heard of, but it is the nerve center of White House operations. They have control over the president's budget. They oversee the agencies, the regulations agencies issue, enormous amount of control over federal bureaucrats, the federal workforce, civil service. And Russ Vought is 100% dedicated to executing on the agenda of Project 2025. He was an author of this document, and he said he's been planning this for 4 years, waiting for the president to be elected. And he was quoted before the administration took office, but he was quoted as saying he wants to put the federal workforce in trauma. And I believe that is exactly what they're doing, sort of empowering Elon Musk to go agency by agency, get access to private data, put people on leave if they get in the way of them accessing the agency's files and information, systematically fire all employees who are in the first few years of service. They're called probationary employees, but they're expected to be permanent career employees. Fire them. Russ Vought is absolutely dedicated to carrying out, I think, the agenda of Project 2025. He's an enormously powerful figure. So that's just one example of what I see playing out. I think they're hewing as closely to that document as possible. And there's some cultural features of Project 2025 too that are also being echoed, being implemented by the administration. There, these orders that declare that there are two genders, really offensive executive orders that talk about, declaring that there are two sexes and only that, and that is how the federal government's going to treat, and sort of lambasting Democrats for ruining society, and all this ideological language that's really misplaced in these official documents from the President of the United States. It's just deeply offensive. It's meant to insult. In some respects, the administration sounds and acts very cruelly, that in a way that's really unknown to historical presidencies. It's very striking if you read the language of the executive orders, essentially accusing Democrats and anybody aligned with Democrats of being Marxists and leftists and enemies of the state. That's the tone and the tenor if you read through these executive orders. And there's some of this same tone and tenor and ideology in Project 2025. So I think they're very closely aligned.
Can you discuss how these orders might be part of a broader effort to centralize presidential power?
Well, there's no doubt that these orders are absolutely determined to create a kind of imperial presidency. In every way possible, the president has asserted that he has more power as president than any other president ever understood himself to have. I mean, Richard Nixon, you guys are too young to know who Richard Nixon was, but historically in the United States, he was the last president who, of course, created a terrible scandal, which now is known, popularized as the Watergate scandal. But the behavior of Richard Nixon in bugging and monitoring his enemies, being part of a slush fund that was funding burglars who went into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, that all of this was wrapped up in the scandal known as Watergate. And that now appears quaint compared to what President Trump is doing. It was Nixon who said, well, if the president does it, it's not illegal. That was sort of the strongest statement of, an imperial presidency. But even Nixon had to give away, had to resign in the face of the exposure of what he had been doing and the threat of impeachment. And even he respected the fact that the politics of the moment demanded that he resign. And so we have not seen anything beyond Nixon's behavior since. And Trump has already in 1 month just gone well beyond anything we've ever witnessed before in terms of the assertion of power. And when I say that, what I mean is some of the things I mentioned earlier, asserting that essentially the president can freeze all federal funding, both internationally and domestically, even though it's Congress that has a constitutional power to appropriate funds. The president's just acting like he can do what he wants with congressional money. The president has also, as I mentioned earlier, decided that he can fire officials who are supposed to be protected from being fired only for cause or malfeasance or neglect of duty. He's just decided he can clear them out. And so he seems to have a view of the presidency which is unlimited and uncontrolled by the other branches, and even suggesting, that J.D. Vance, the vice president, has suggested that the best advice he's given Trump is that to ignore courts that have no rightful role in controlling the legitimate actions of the executive branch. He said something like that, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like courts do not have the authority to interfere with the legitimate executive authority. Now, in a way, that statement is just an empty truism. Of course, if you're behaving lawfully, legitimate executive authority, then the court has no reason to interfere with you. So a lot turns on what does legitimate mean. But the implication of Vance's statement, the vice president's statement, the implication went beyond his use of the word the phrase legitimate executive authority to basically suggest, listen, we can just ignore you, judges. And my advice to the president was to just ignore you. And if that's the line they're pursuing, that they're going to pick and choose which judicial decisions to respect, then we're into a situation of lawlessness that we have never seen before in the United States. Now, we're not there yet. I don't want to be so alarmist as to suggest we're there yet, but I'm certainly waiting to see how far they really go down that line.
This is exactly why the rule of law exists, to prevent this situation.
Yeah, it's interesting because these ideas, these phrases, the rule of law, even the word democracy, if you talk to people, political consultants and experts in campaigns and polling and the political process down here in the U.S., they'll say that people don't really care about that when you ask them. It's too abstract. Democracy, a system of government, and rule of law, what does that mean? And even if you talk about the federal workforce, well, nobody likes bureaucrats. Nobody likes government. So it's hard to get traction, to get a public response to this when you say, well, they're dismantling the government, they're undermining democracy, they're destroying checks and balances. There's a sort of reaction among political professionals, well, people don't care about that. I'm a law professor. I find that astonishing. But your point is exactly right. The whole point of the American system of constitutionalism, the separation of powers, as I mentioned, in the three branches, different again from the Canadian system, but nevertheless a system purposefully designed to check the power of the president to ensure we don't have a king, right? The whole impetus for it is to prevent this kind of accumulation and concentration of power in a single individual. And the rule of law that we've created in a number of statutes, laws that Congress has passed, that are meant to protect a professional civil service, career employees with expertise who know how to check the food and drug supply, who know how to protect public health and safety, who in theory know how to prevent trains from derailing, and who investigate those accidents to hopefully prevent them from ever happening again. These professionals who know how to clean up nuclear waste sites, contamination, who know how to go into disaster zones and make sure they're safe for people to re-enter. I could go on and on and on. These professional civil servants, if you decimate them, you destroy essential government services that people count on. And we have a system of law that is historically, 100 years old to protect a professional civil service and to convert it from what used to be true in the 19th century to be a system of spoils where if your guy won the presidency, if your guy won the election, you get the jobs. They would hand out jobs as rewards. Well, we have successfully converted that system of spoils into a system of professionalism. Canada has this in its professional ministries, right? Permanent career staff who stay when the politicians come and go at the top of the leadership. They stay because they have the expertise, the knowledge, the integrity to carry out the mission of the ministry or the agency. Well, our whole system of rule of law is under duress at the moment. There's a huge pressure on our institutions and whether they're hold up to this kind of abuse. And so we will see. We will see what unfolds in the U.S., whether the courts will step up and put some guardrails around the president, whether Congress will wake up and do its oversight job, performance responsibility, whether the Democrats will manage to win back the House in 2 years. All this will play out, and we'll see whether we're going to go down the road of further destroying the rule of law or whether we're going to retreat from the precipice and protect it.
So I just want to turn now to your article. You recently wrote an article on Trump's campaign of what you call structural deregulation. Could you briefly explain what structural deregulation is, how it differs from standard deregulation, and how you argue that this aggressive approach is designed to undermine the federal government's ability to fulfill its core functions?
Well, I talked a little about this before, so I'll try to keep this short, but the article essentially is an argument we wrote in 2021, a few years ago, after the first Trump presidency. And we wrote it reflecting back on several presidencies to describe how a chief executive in the United States might go about, if they really wanted to, the things they could do to really disable federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Food and Drug Administration or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What would they do to dismantle the government? And we sort of went through a series of things, including firing key staff, demonizing the agencies and the public to undermine trust and destroy morale, impound funds that are supposed to support the work of these agencies and destroy reputation and so on. And we went through this whole list. And then we cataloged all the laws that are supposed to get in the way of this kind of thing. And we talked about how they were either pretty easy to work around or they would be too late because after the fact it's hard to enforce them in court. And we sort of discussed all this. And then we talked about what the Constitution was supposed to do to constrain this. So we went through all of these things and we concluded that the real bulwark against an aggressive president seeking to centralize power and destroy the federal government capacity was Congress, that Congress had to act. And just relying on the courts would not be enough because by the time the law catches up to this sort of firing and dismantling and seizing of funds and so on, by the time the law catches up, it's too late. And we published this, right, like several years ago. And now we realized we were not pessimistic enough. And so we put out this blog on Lawfare that sort of updates what has this administration been doing that goes even beyond what we anticipated or foresaw. And when you fire, as I mentioned before, career prosecutors and you fire career staff and you replace them with political loyalists, you essentially just politicize the government. What you're doing is saying, at all these agencies, what we want is faithfulness and fidelity to whatever we say. We're less concerned about the law. We're less concerned about the facts. We're less concerned about adherence to norms. What we care about is you do what we say. That's the message. And that's what I mean by structural deregulation. You make it impossible for agencies to do the jobs that they were tasked with. Like Congress passed a food and drug law that says keep the food and drug supplies safe. Congress passes meat inspection laws that says make sure meat's not contaminated. Congress passes laws to ensure that remember the plane that overturned at Pearson recently, to make sure the planes land safely, to make sure the trains don't derail, to make sure that consumers aren't defrauded when they go and buy goods or buy insurance products or invest in the market. They pass laws to do these things, and they say to these agencies, your job is to implement this law. Your job is to enforce this law. That's the system of delegating power to agencies. And you have a similar system in Canada, where the ministries really take charge of day-to-day work. And that's what I mean by structural deregulation, is to take the knees out from those agencies by depriving them of the funding they needed, taking their experts and firing them or demoting them or moving them into unrelated jobs. All of this the Trump administration is doing. And that's different from everyday deregulation, where let's say you weaken a pollution rule. Like, we're used to administrations rolling back some rules and, making it easier for the banks to do business and charge more for credit card fees, versus another administration that would crack down on that. That's average deregulation, right? That's like making it a little less protective for the public versus being a little more burdensome for industry. That kind of back and forth pendulum swing, more regulation, less regulation, we're used to that. What I'm describing to you is well beyond average standard regulation and deregulation. It's about undermining the ability of the government to do its job.
That wraps up part 1 of our 2-part discussion with Jody Freeman. Join us next time as we further explore structural deregulation and environmental policy.
The Hearsay podcast is a joint project between CJSW 90.9 FM and Pro Bono Students Canada, University of Calgary chapter. If you would like to hear more podcasts like this, the Hearsay podcast can be found on Google Podcasts, Apple Music, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.